Okay, so last time we were talking about Article 38 of the International Court of Justice. And again, just to remind you, Article 38 of the International Court of Justice essentially sets forth the hierarchy of the four primary sources of law that the International Court will look at in the event of a dispute. So, international conventions or treaties, international customary law, general principles of law, and then finally we have teachings and judicial decisions. So let's continue and talk more about treaties and just work our way through this list and talk about some of the terms that I want you to know for this class. And these are terms that I want you to incorporate into your essay questions when you write your essay questions. And also these are terms that I'll have test questions about. So, first of all, when we talk about treaty law, one of the reasons that we say it's the most important source of international law currently in modern international law, as opposed to historically, is that it essentially embodies the idea of consent of a sovereign state. Now, what I mean by that is, as we've talked about the idea of sovereignty, a state as a sovereign is in control of its own territory, and essentially there's no higher authority within that territory than the state itself. And so treaty law is so important because basically a sovereign is agreeing in a way, if you think about it, to limit its sovereignty by agreeing to a treaty. So if you're sovereign, you have the power over your state and the territory and everything else. And when you enter into a treaty, just like when you enter into a contract, you are agreeing to be bound by the terms of the treaty. A treaty is essentially a form of a contract. And so the idea then is that by agreeing to the treaty, a country, a sovereign state, is agreeing to the terms of the treaty, which may include, in some cases, limiting what a sovereign could otherwise do if it was not constrained by the terms of a treaty. That may include things like agreeing to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, agreeing to the United Nations Charter, which is basically a giant treaty, whereby a sovereign state, by agreeing to join the UN, this is also true of the World Trade Organization and also very true of the European Union, all of which are really big treaties, that the states are limiting their ability to act as a sovereign, and that may, in some cases, actually harm them. There may be adverse court decisions which they otherwise would not follow, but because they have agreed to be bound by a treaty, they are obligated to follow the outcome of a court decision, or may limit the use of force, or may limit how they go about obtaining resources like drilling for oil or mining. So that's why we look at treaties as being one of the embodiment of consent, because it's an agreement that the sovereign has entered into. Now, we'll also talk about how treaties will potentially bind, well, generally speaking, bind future regimes that are in power. So if you have a power change within a country, after an election or whatever, treaty law still binds the country even if the new regime or administration or whatever doesn't necessarily agree with it. And that's one of the fundamental principles of treaty law, is that it will bind future administrations or whatever, however you want to call it, on a political level, because it's a contract. It's one of the reasons we still have Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, because of that. Even though there's been a regime change in Cuba, that came out of essentially a lease, a type of a lease, which was a treaty with the previous government. So treaty law is the most important source of law, primarily because it's showing that a sovereign country is agreeing to the terms. That's why we say it's the most important source in some reflect. All right, I want to move forward here and talk about some of the terms. So let's go to page 23. So let's talk about this term right here. Under the law of treaties, pacta sunt servanda. It's on page 23. So this is a phrase, it's a Latin phrase. Pacta means agreement. Sunt means should. Servanda means follow, right? Or served. So this is the doctrine that when, and we have the same rule domestically when we talk about contract law. This is essentially a Latin term that refers to the idea that when you enter into an agreement, along with that is you have an obligation in good faith to follow through on that agreement. That you have to serve the pact, the agreement that you made. And other parties to the agreement can rely upon your good faith in honoring an agreement. And so when we talk about good faith, what we mean by that is essentially the terms of the agreement, the material purpose of a treaty must be followed. Otherwise, you are in violation of the treaty, even if strictly by the written rule or the written language of the treaty, you could argue that you're not in default on the treaty. So I'll give you kind of a goofy example. So let's say the treaty involves a war, and there's an agreement reached for a ceasefire in the war. That basically says that for the next 7 days, neither party will engage in hostile activities, they will engage in diplomacy, they will not fire weapons at each other for the next 7 days. All right, so day one goes by, and then at nighttime, one side starts shooting rockets or lobbing bombs or whatever. And you say, well, wait a minute, you just agreed to a 7-day ceasefire. Well, it said 7 days, not nights. You're like, okay, that's just not pacta sunt servanda, right? That's not good faith. Even if under the technical terms, you could make this squishy argument that you're following the terms of a treaty. So this is a phrase that's used, we use it in domestic law as well, that you have a good faith obligation to not try to go around, especially the material purpose of a treaty. If you are, then you're in violation of the treaty, even if you look at the technical wording, you would not be. I know it's kind of a crummy example, but it's all I can think of right now. So pacta sunt servanda. Now we're going to see this term in the Vienna Convention, which we'll get to in a moment, which is a treaty involving treaties. This is a customary rule of international law that developed over time and now has been put into written form, as I'll show you in a little bit. All right, so that's one term I want you to know. The next term, and this is probably, in my opinion, the most important phrase in international law altogether. And that is the term peremptory norm of general international law, the Latin phrase jus cogens. And this is a term I definitely want you to talk about in your essay questions. I have several test questions on the midterm, if I remember, about this term. And this goes back to the rhetorical question I asked you in the last class. What is the most important source of international law? We look at Article 38 and it says it's a treaty law. Historically, it's been customary. What did the sovereigns do? And this is where this comes in, where I believe that customary law is still, in many ways, the highest form of international law under the doctrine of jus cogens. So let me explain what this is. Peremptory means to come in front of, to have higher authority, to be more important than, to override, however you want to phrase it, must be, whatever term you want to use. Peremptory. Norm means a way of behaving, a way of acting, what you do, how you do something. So a peremptory norm is a way of behaving that must be followed essentially no matter what. It is absolutely required. There's no deviation from it. It is something that is so important that it will essentially override anything else. A peremptory norm of general international law is then going to be a norm or way of behaving that is accepted and recognized by the international community from which no derogation is permitted. No derogation is permitted. Now, what does that mean? That means that you have to follow it. You cannot stray away from a peremptory norm. So when we talk about peremptory norm, let's go over to the next slide, page 24. When we talk about a peremptory norm of general international law, we are talking about some type of activities that are considered so heinous or bad or whatever word you want to use, that they are just simply a violation of international law as a matter of fact. And these are things like slavery, genocide, apartheid, piracy, use of torture, use of aggressive war, in some cases use of chemical weapons. Well, in most cases there's not really any derogation from that either. So this is the idea that there are some activities that a sovereign may engage in that even if the sovereign state did not agree to a treaty prohibiting it, that even if the sovereign is only engaging in that action within the boundaries of its own country, that even if the sovereign or historically other states have done it, that now we have this idea that it is generally accepted that those type of activities just are not permissible as a matter of jus cogens. They are of such stature that a country just simply cannot engage in those activities. And if they do, it violates international law as a matter of fact. Ipso facto is the term that's used. Now, this phrase, jus cogens, a compelling norm, a peremptory norm of general international law, this dovetails back to last time we talked about the different relationships in international law. If you'll remember that historically international law was only involving interactions of sovereigns, but over time that has changed to where interactions of how the sovereign in its own domestic boundaries treats its own people, even if it's purely within the boundaries of the state, can rise to a violation of international law, even if it does not cross outside the boundaries of that or the territory of that particular sovereign. Where historically that was not the case for various reasons, primarily practical and political. So now where I'm getting at with this is, again, back to the theme over and over, rule of law versus rule of force. So this is now the idea that if a state is engaging in violation of a peremptory norm, then international organizations such as the United Nations through the Security Council or other means may have the authority to go in and solve or stop that particular violation of a peremptory norm. So in essence, what I'm getting at is this is the idea that a peremptory norm is essentially still, it's customary law, right? it is essentially still the highest form of international law because it is this idea of something that is so wrong that it simply will not be tolerated. Now, that's all in theory, right? We all know in the real world that it happens all the time. But in theory, this is the idea that a state cannot engage in slavery or genocide within its own country, even if it doesn't cross the boundaries of the country. And this is the idea that if a state is engaged in that type of activity, international law prohibits that and therefore can be acted upon by the international community, even if in the real world it doesn't really happen. Now, a lot of this, of course, came out of World War I and World War II. Chemical weapons in World War I, mustard gas, etc., horrible weapons that were just, everybody agreed should not be used. Of course, World War II with genocide, and then going on through today. Now, again, a lot of what I'm talking about here, we know still happens, but this is the fundamental legal theory idea on the basis for international organizations such as the UN, primarily the United Nations, to be able to, in essence, act as a bit of a police force to stop these type of actions. Now, later on, we're going to look at the Vienna Convention, which is a treaty that essentially puts into writing this idea that a peremptory norm is the highest form of law, even if a country that is engaged in that activity has not signed a treaty where they agree to prohibit it. It's also used to say that if countries enter into a treaty between themselves where they agree to engage in these type of activities, that treaty is void, even if otherwise historically it would have been normal. So I cannot emphasize this phrase enough. This is a phrase that is utilized in many different treaties, utilized in analysis of actions of states as to whether or not their activities are a violation of a peremptory norm of general international law. It's probably the highest source. If you ever get real bored, go look it up on Google, and there are a lot of different law school or law review articles and other type of articles about jus cogens, or jus cogens, depending on who you ask. Now, this is also an area where you see over time perhaps the development of new peremptory norms as things happen in the world. Environmental law, perhaps, at some point may rise to that level on an international, global basis. Now, we've seen with COVID and the pandemic, I'm not sure if it could be argued it's there yet, but I think the idea would be that in some cases, a pandemic-like activity could rise to that level. We'll probably see arguments made that the use of autonomous weapons, that is a robotic weapon that is not controlled by a human at some level, rises to that level at some point. Indiscriminate, Terminator, right? Type of activity. So this is a constantly evolving notion of law that will change over time with technology and things that develop in the world and beyond. So I cannot emphasize this enough. I'm going to be talking about peremptory norms over and over. And this is also, again, this dovetails into this whole idea of rule of law versus rule of force. And this also forms the foundational theoretical basis for the creation of international organizations such as the UN as one of the driving factors for a trend towards intergovernmental organizations, and we're going to look at those more next week. Okay, so peremptory norm, jus cogens, a compelling norm, must be followed. Now, countries may not agree with that. Some countries may say, well, wait a minute, we're not on board with these things. We've never agreed not to do it. And as we'll see in a little bit with the Vienna Convention, in some cases it doesn't matter whether they've agreed or not, because it is a peremptory norm. Now that's all fine on paper, right? Real world, this goes back to the very first day of class. If a law is not enforced, is it still a law? Are peremptory norms always enforced? No, we know that. In the real world, in a perfect world, they would be, but they're not. I mean, that's just reality. Just like in domestic law, you know, 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, which is not a peremptory norm by any means, but it's not always enforced either. So, you know, it's easy to sit here and talk about theory on paper, but this is the basis for it. Later on, we get to the UN, we'll talk about when use of force is authorized under the Charter. This is one of the bases for the use of force, potentially as a violation of a peremptory norm. All right, so let's keep moving and talk about some more terms. We talk about treaty law. Next slide down. A self-executing treaty versus a non-self-executing treaty. So, a treaty, as we know, is an agreement, contract, basically. And so one of the things we look at when we look at a treaty, and this is more going to involve a treaty that is not rising to the level of a peremptory norm. So this would be more like an environmental treaty, a treaty involving a boundary between countries, or other type of activities such as fisheries or whatever you want to, trade law, etc. So a self-executing treaty is, the idea there is that this is an agreement, a treaty, that's when entered into by whomever has the authority for that particular sovereign, be it a president or a prime minister or a monarch or whoever's in charge, whoever has that authority within that own country. The idea of a self-executing treaty is that the treaty itself has automatic effect as soon as it's been ratified by that country. That is, the language of the treaty does not need any domestic enabling legislation. It's effective directly upon ratification. Now, what do I mean by that? That means that the treaty essentially is detailed enough that it in itself becomes sort of legislation, that there's sufficient detail within the treaty that the states that are involved in the treaty do not need to enact any of their own laws to be in compliance with the treaty, because the treaty automatically has enough detail, information, etc., that it directly creates law. A non-self-executing treaty is different. This is a treaty that basically is more of a generalized principle, and then it's up to the states that are joining on to the treaty to write internal law within their own legal systems to make and carry out the purposes of the treaty. And the treaty does not really become effective until those domestic laws have been written by the countries that are involved. So, for example, like a non-self-executing treaty might be an environmental treaty, whereby the countries agree that they will adopt standards for diesel and gasoline and other fuels that meet certain standards involving sulfur and other particulates. And then the states basically agree that they will meet these standards by adopting legislation within their own countries, however their internal legal systems are established, either through legislation or administrative rule or whatever, to carry out the purposes of the treaty. Most treaties are going to be non-self-executing, because the treaty itself will be a generalized principle, and then it's up to the states to enact legislation to carry out the terms of the treaty. Now, the practical implication of that is whether or not a state actually gets around to doing it. So that's the problem. So a state may say, in principle, okay, we agree, so let's just say it's the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of another country. They agree on the general principles of a certain type of activity, but the legislature within the country doesn't approve or does not carry out and actually adopt the legislation. Then you got this issue of, okay, well, the treaty itself was entered into, but it was never fully adopted because there's no legislation domestically to carry out the provisions of the treaty. And the question is the country in violation of the treaty when the legislature of that particular country doesn't carry it out? We see a lot of that with the World Trade Organization, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks. But the WTO basically is kind of that type of a structure where the WTO members will agree on generalized principles involving trade law, international or environmental law, patents and trademarks, things like that. But then it's up to the members of the WTO themselves to adopt internal legislation to carry out those general ideas. And then if a country does not, then other countries can file a grievance with the WTO to essentially force the countries to do that. So I'm making it gets kind of blurry, so I'm trying to keep it pretty simple. So basically, self-executing is detailed enough, it automatically goes into effect. Non-self-executing, there's some sort of legislation or other type of lawmaking that must be done to carry out the purposes of the treaty. All right, then we have the term ratification. Excuse me. So this term ratification goes by different names, maybe adoption or formal, whatever you want to call it. But essentially the term ratification means that, and it will depend on what the law is domestically within a state, what steps have to be taken in order for the treaty to be considered binding within a state under its own domestic law. So, as we've talked about already here in the United States, under Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, the President has the power, with the advice and consent right here of the Senate, to make treaties. So that requires basically agreement by the Senate in order to have a treaty become valid. That's a form of a check and a balance within our Constitution. Other countries may have direct ratification authority within the executive. So if it's a prime minister or an ambassador or whatever, they may be given the authority to directly ratify the treaty and without any further approval of other branches of government. And that all depends on how the country's legal system is established. And again, that sort of goes back to common law versus civil law countries, and they have different rules on how they adopt things, especially in the European Union. They have this issue all the time. Most of the European Union mandates are going to be self-executing, but not always. So essentially, a non-self-executing treaty will require domestic legislation. A self-executing treaty automatically goes into effect when it's been ratified. Spend enough time on that. All right, next slide over. Okay, a dispositive treaty. This is a phrase that's typically used to describe a treaty that involves a boundary, a territory, a servitude, which is like the Panama Canal Zone used to be a servitude, which was a form of an easement, kind of. So a dispositive treaty essentially is a treaty that establishes the territory of countries, and the idea of a dispositive treaty is that once that treaty has been entered into, it essentially will be binding no matter what, even if you have a change in regimes. Now, where we see this happen sometimes is in a situation where maybe historically the boundary between two countries was maybe a river, and then over the course of time, perhaps the boundaries of the river have changed due to flooding or an earthquake or a volcano or something like that. And so the idea then would be, and there have been real world disputes over this very issue that have gone to the International Court of Justice. The idea that a dispositive treaty will establish that territory and perhaps a way, in the event of a change, a geographical change on how to determine if that will also change the territorial boundaries. Now, I don't want to get into all the nuances there, it gets a little bit complex, but when I use that term dispositive treaty, that's essentially a treaty that's establishing a boundary. So, and those are binding in the future unless they are modified by both parties to the treaty, even if you have a regime change. Okay, merger rule. This is a rule that says that the treaties that are in effect in a former state remain in effect when it becomes part of a new state. So if you have two states that join together to form one state, the treaties that both states were party to automatically apply to that new state. So if you have state A and state B that are both part of a treaty with other countries and they join, then under the merger rule, the treaties that they were both part of will now apply to the newly created state. That's pretty obvious. What happens when you have two states that join, but one state has agreed to a treaty and another one has not? Well, if it's a peremptory norm, it doesn't matter. It will be binding on the new state no matter what. If it's a dispositive treaty, it will be binding on the new state as well. If it's not, then it's kind of however it plays out. But for right now, I just want to keep it simple. The merger rule is when two states combine into one, then they are required to follow the treaties that both states were party to prior to the joinder. Now, similar type of a term, this next slide down, this is called the clean slate doctrine. So this is the doctrine or the idea that, and this primarily came out of the independence from former colonies and territories, as you had newly created countries that were now independent from their previous colonial counterparts, that they should be given a clean slate to determine what treaties they want to continue and what treaties they do not wish to continue that they used to be bound by the former colonial power. So we saw a lot of this in the Caribbean countries, well, really all around the world, as we saw decolonialization occur throughout the world over the past few hundred years. So the idea that a new state coming into existence, excuse me, through decolonialization is under no obligation to succeed to the treaties of the former colonial power. Now, the new state could ratify and agree that they will continue with that type of treaty, but they are not going to be held to that treaty unless it is a dispositive treaty or a treaty involving a general peremptory norm, which will be binding no matter what. So the reason for this exception to the clean slate doctrine on dispositive treaties is that boundary that's established either by custom or course of action over time if you have a new state that's created, they still have to acknowledge and follow the boundaries of the former state or the former colonial territory, because that affects another state too, the boundary, right? So I do have a test question. The reason I point that out is, what are some exceptions to the clean slate doctrine? There are basically two of them. There are more than that, but the two I want you to know about. Number one, if the treaty is a dispositive treaty, that will still carry forward. And part two is if the treaty involves a peremptory norm, it will also continue to apply. And that's just a general rule of international law. You have to follow peremptory norms. All right. Next page over. Next term. Excuse me. An executive agreement. So this is a phrase that's used to describe a situation whereby the chief executives of a particular sovereign state or their representatives, such as an ambassador or a diplomat or a delegate, or like in our case, a secretary of state perhaps, or it could be military officers. This is the idea that a treaty or an international agreement entered into by the state's executive without following the state's internally mandated laws on ratification is not a treaty technically, and it is not effective domestically. So, for example, in the United States, if the president enters into, and this is pretty common, I mean, you see this quite often, where the president or the secretary of state will enter into an agreement with one or more other countries, but it's never formally ratified by the Senate. It's never actually sometimes presented to the Senate at all. And it may go by different names. It may be called an accord, which is a French word for an agreement. And so this may be something where the president or the executive or whoever is saying, this is what we will do, and we will follow these rules, but there's never a formal treaty adopted. Now, that's not going to be binding domestically within a country because you haven't followed the internal law of the country. In fact, it may not even be a treaty at all. It's nothing more than an agreement among whoever's in charge of the country at the time. So this is where we get into kind of a circular argument. And this is where customary international law again comes into play. We say that a treaty law is the highest form of law. An executive agreement technically is not a treaty because it hasn't been formally ratified or done in accordance with the domestic law. But sometimes the executive agreement may be an agreement that essentially is carrying out customary law, which would otherwise be binding upon a country even if there was no treaty. So I give the example here, the law of the sea, Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United States has never formally adopted the Convention of the Law of the Sea. It's the United Nations Convention, and I've talked about this before. However, we have had a number of different presidents and secretaries of state publicly make proclamations. We will follow certain provisions of the law of the sea because they are customary law, like navigational rules. And that's just as, even though we haven't agreed to the formal treaty, there is basically executive action that has taken place that acknowledges that part of the treaty essentially is customary law and has to be followed anyway. That's kind of, like I say, kind of a circular argument. So this is sort of an interesting thing because even though the president has to get approval from the Senate, that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily true if it's also customary law. It would still be binding upon a country. So really all I want you to know when I use this phrase executive agreement it's something that looks like a treaty, but it's really not, because it has not been adopted in the legally required manner. And as a general rule, it will not be enforceable unless the agreement also embodies customary international law that the country has already been following historically, like navigational rules. Okay. Next slide down. I'm going to highlight this whole slide because this one, very important. Codification. I'm going to be using this term quite often. This is one of the ideas of intergovernmental organizations such as the UN and others, WTO. So codification refers to the process of putting into writing customary international law that previously was not really necessarily a written document, but was followed as a matter of customary international law, whether a peremptory norm or not. And the idea of codification is to write down, put into written form customary rules so that, number one, they can be researched. Number two, so we know which countries are acknowledging customary international law. And three, so they can become public. So they're out there, so we know what's out there. This is one of the functions of the United Nations, which you don't hear about a whole lot, but is to try to codify, or that is put into writing, either through treaties or other means, conventions or whatever, customary international law or other practices that were not necessarily in writing in the past. Now again, historically, customary international law is really the primary driver of international law. We talk about merchants and the rules that they had, that they would acknowledge just as a matter of merchant courtesy with each other, and then those were written down, beginning with the Roman Empire, and Lex Mercatoria, which were written laws of business. So that's you know, this is not a new thing. This has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. But now we talk about this term as being one of the ideas behind the development of international law, is putting it into writing. So that's when I say codification, that's what I'm talking about, putting rules and practices, etc., into written format so they can become a treaty or an executive agreement or some other written document, other than just, you know, practice. In other words, oral or verbal or other, however you want to phrase it. This usually leads to treaties or conventions. Now there's another term that goes along with this that I'll be using, and I'll show you when we get to the United Nations Convention, or Charter, excuse me. Progressive development of international law. Progressive development of international law. This is a term that refers to the idea that, and I've talked about this already, but this is the formal term. This is the term that refers to the idea that one of the goals of this idea of going from rule of force to rule of law is to develop treaties and conventions, to put in writing, codify previous existing custom, and then also to look forward into the future to develop treaties and conventions before things become a problem. To put rules in place now to try to get countries to agree on how things will be handled in the future, rather than waiting until problems develop and the countries then have to figure out retroactively how to solve the problem. So progressive development is the idea of being prospective. That means looking forward rather than retrospective, which means looking backwards. The idea being, if we can put together treaties now that lay the ground rules for things that are going to occur in the future or might occur in the future, that will lead to a reduction in potential conflict and potential war or economic trade wars by having those rules in place. It also is a way that the United Nations can actually, even though the UN cannot legislate, the UN can initiate international law making through progressive development. That is, putting together conventions, treaties, seminars, whatever you want to call it, if nothing else, to discuss the issue, even if no formal agreements are reached. So when I use that term progressive development, the International Law Commission, which is an adjunct of the United Nations, that's part of their job, is to progressively develop international law to hopefully solve these issues, or at least start a conversation before things get out of hand. This also refers to another idea, which we'll kind of look at more when we get to organizations, international organizations, which will be next week. And this is the idea that one of the functions of international organizations like the UN, the WTO, etc., is to not only engage in treaty making, but to provide a forum whereby countries have the ability, if there is a problem that is developing or a problem that is likely to develop, to provide a forum where that problem can be discussed rather than waiting for something bad to happen and essentially a war starts. World War I was essentially partly to blame because there really wasn't an active forum, and it was up to the countries that were in the dispute to try to solve it themselves. So I kind of use this analogy. It's sort of like, I don't do divorce law anymore, but I used to do a lot of it. And it used to be that the spouses that were getting divorced had to try to figure it out on their own. Well, that's not easy when you're in an emotional and tense relationship. Same thing with countries, right? So the trend has been in divorce law for the past 3 decades, more than that even, but really the last 30 years, to provide for mediators that can meet with both parties, usually separately, but sometimes together, to try to work out the details of custody of the children, to work out details of how you're going to split your assets and your retirement, who's going to get the house, how debt's going to be divided up. And so it's more of a business-like transaction rather than all of the emotional things that come into it. And it's worked very well in family law. Now, I'm making that comparison because we see that with progressive development, this whole notion of treaties can have that effect, but it also is the idea of providing this forum. That's one of the roles of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and it says that right in the Charter, to provide a forum to bring to the attention of the international community events that could lead to a breach of security and peace. Now again, does that always happen? Real world? No. But that's the idea. Same thing with the WTO. That's one of the ideas behind the World Trade Organization, is to provide a forum that's there all the time, permanently staffed in Geneva, Switzerland, so that issues can be brought to the members of the WTO to discuss to hopefully avoid trade wars. When I say trade war, it means primarily embargoes and tariffs. Okay, so progressive development, looking forward into the future to codify or hopefully create treaties, and then also to provide a forum. I'm going to write the word forum on there. And one more point on that. Historically, international law, this again is kind of like divorce. Historically, international law, when there was a problem, it was up to the sovereigns to try to figure it out on their own. So, back in the days of city-states and kings and whatever, if there was a problem, there was no third party to go to. to try to solve it, not generally speaking. And so it was up to the parties themselves to exchange diplomats or try to work it out on their own, and that just really wasn't very effective. And that's, again, this idea of creating these methods, which is part of this idea of rule of law, to allow for there to be third-party intervention, such as a court, to help solve those issues rather than resort to military or economic force. All right, so let's move on and talk about some customary international law, which is, again, number 2 on the ICJ, Article 38, as a source of law. So when we say custom, typically speaking, when we refer to customary international law, we are talking about rules that have been established through activity, actions of governments or people that essentially have created a norm as a matter of fact, a way of behaving, and over time have been developed and created essentially the idea that there are some actions that rise to the level more than just courtesy, that they have to be, that they are law, even if they're not necessarily written down. And again, we're talking going back hundreds and thousands of years, hundreds and or even some cases thousands of years, back to Roman Empire, etc. So when we talk about customary international law, these are rules that develop over time, as a matter of speaking. But with that said, there's no set time frame. Custom can occur very quickly. Custom may literally happen within minutes. I'm going to go to the next page over here. And I want to give you the Sputnik example. You guys know what the Sputnik is? Is that in your book? Is that do you have that? Is it in your book, this page?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, because I know there's another version of this book floating around where I don't have that slide. So the Sputnik was the first satellite, and it was put up by the Soviet Union back when President Kennedy was president. And so, interesting idea here when we talk about international law and custom. So prior to the Sputnik, international customary law was essentially the idea that the airspace over a country was part of the country itself. And that if you went into airspace within the atmosphere, you were violating the territory of that country, and the country could act in self-defense and basically shoot you down. So now comes along the Sputnik, and this is again the beginning of the space race. So now we have the Sputnik that's going around the Earth, and of course it's going around and over what used to be thought of as the airspace of sovereign countries all throughout the world, right? But the US primarily was the main driver here. So now the President Kennedy essentially is faced with this dilemma, and this literally happens in minutes. So historically, if there was an aircraft, they would have shot it down, or at least gone up and escorted it out of the airspace, but more likely shot it down back then. So now you've got a satellite going around, which of course is beyond the atmosphere. And so the question is, all right, is that different than an aircraft? Because it's in space. And so the president then had to make a decision, do we shoot it down? Now that's assuming we had the technology to even do that, which I'm not sure if we did or not. But even assuming we did, the president decided not going to shoot it down. That essentially created customary international law in that very moment. Because, and along with that, it created the idea that outer space is different than the atmosphere. And therefore, in a way of making a comparison, outer space was more like the open ocean, high seas, beyond the territorial limits, like we've talked about with a cannon, 3 miles. So the Sputnik is an example of how international law can really happen instantaneously by the actions of the government, by governments. By not shooting it down or taking other retaliatory action, if you will, essentially that created the first part of the law of outer space as a matter of customary law. Why? So if you're the president, I would probably make the same, I would probably do the same thing. Why? Why not shoot it down? Biggest reason why, we're going to want to put our own satellites up, right? And of course nowadays they're all over the place, Dish Network and everything else. So the idea was, I mean, I can just imagine, nobody knew exactly what the purpose of that was. It was very secretive. Was it a weapon? What is it? If we shoot it down, then Soviet Union's going to shoot down ours, and we're going to end up in a space war. Looking out into the future, again, progressive development. Let's look out in the future as technology advances, and of course we, at that time, were developing manned space flight, eventually going to the moon. So the idea was, well, we're going to want to be able to rely upon this idea that we want to be able to use outer space in the same manner. And if we shoot down the Soviet satellite, then they're going to shoot ours down, and then, not just the US and the Soviets, but other countries. And so you end up essentially with this idea that space is customarily now open as a matter of all countries may use it if they have the technological means. And so it was fundamentally different. So customary law was created in that moment, or those moments. And I imagine it must have been a very tense discussion. Because Cold War going on at that time. So when I talk about customary rules, there's no set time frame. Now, historically, customary law was developed as a matter of natural consequences, the law of the coral reef, like we've talked about, or navigational rules. But custom, essentially, doesn't have a set time frame. It can happen instantaneously. Now, since that time, we've seen other technological advances with the internet and whatnot that have created customary law. And this goes back to the idea of codification that I talked about a few minutes ago. So one of the goals of codification is to write down this customary law so that hopefully it can be part of a treaty. And that actually did lead to, we have a convention on use of space, which is still being formulated. Now here's something else. A treaty, so most customary rules become treaties through the process of codification. But this is also an interesting thing. So we have customary rule. It's then put into writing. It's then adopted by countries as a treaty. But that treaty can then create custom of its own on countries that are not part of the treaty. So let's just use the Sputnik case. If a treaty is then developed that says that outer space is open to all countries that have the technology, so long as they do not use it for aggressive means, that essentially that treaty creates custom that would then be binding on other non-signatory countries or countries that flat out don't have the technology yet to go into space. So, sort of a chicken and the egg thing. Custom can create a treaty through codification, and that treaty can then create custom that's binding upon countries that are not part of the treaty, at least initially. And then it kind of goes in a circle, so to speak. So I go back to my question, what is the highest form of law? If a satellite can essentially create international law in a moment, overnight, right there on the spot, isn't that really the highest form of law, in a way? You don't have the time to sit there and figure out a treaty. It's either we push the button to shoot it down or not. By not pushing the button, you create law, in a way, by your actions. So I don't have an answer to that. I find it very interesting. So in my viewpoint, I still believe that customary law is the primary driver, and typically customary law over time will be codified and put into a treaty. That's part of the role of the UN and other organizations. But I just want you to be aware of kind of this relationship between custom and treaty law. All right, so how do you know? And now we're talking about more of a court, a judicial, basically international court case. So let's say that I am a country arguing that a particular behavior is customary law. And I'm using that as my basis to essentially engage in a lawsuit against another country, and I'm claiming that their activities violate customary law. The other country says, no, what you're saying is not a custom, it's just what you do in your country, we don't agree with that. And so the question is, how does a court decide if it's customary law? There's no treaties on it, so now we have to look at, is it customary law? So there's two phrases that are used. To determine if a behavior rises to the level of being customary international law, or if it's just something less than customary law. Now remember, why is this important? Customary international law under Article 38 of the Court of Justice is the second highest source. So if there's no treaty, then we look at custom. So one of the threshold questions that the Court of Justice or other international tribunals face is this customary law, which is right behind a treaty in terms of importance. So first of all is the doctrine of usus, which again is Latin-based. Is that way of behaving consistently used by the countries in the dispute? Do they actually practice or follow that way of behaving? And so if I'm a country saying this way of behaving is not customary law, but in fact, we're doing it, and that's what we do in our own everyday world, I'm sort of talking, there's an old phrase, talking out both sides of your mouth, right? So one day I do it, next day I don't. I'm not consistent. So if it can be shown that the states use the rule and follow it, that's part one of that test. So a court will say, well, you may say you don't follow it, but you actually do it. Part two is, this is again more Latin, opinio juris et necessitatis, and this is basically the thinking that the action is legally necessary. And this again would go back to the rule must be followed as a matter of law and not some other practice such as comity or courtesy. And probably the better way of looking at that is the idea that a court will look at perhaps the domestic law of the state that's saying they don't follow the custom, but their own internal law basically follows the custom, and that shows that that state has the opinion that that type of activity actually is law. These are kind of hard concepts to describe because it's kind of like you know it when you see it. Probably a better example I could use would be the idea of an offshore limit. So perhaps a country is saying, instead of a 3-mile limit, we have a 200-mile limit. So anything within 200 miles of our country is part of our country in the ocean. But in fact, they don't enforce that 200-mile limit. They only enforce out to maybe 3 miles. So they can say, we say we have a 200-mile limit, but in reality, they're not using that, nor are they acting in a way that shows that they believe that is truly customary law. Now, I just want you to kind of know what those terms are, because it's just something that's so hard to define. But this is also why it's very important from a matter of progressive development to put things in writing, to codify, because by codifying the rule and having countries agree to the treaty through the codification process, that gets rid of this whole problem, because you're now codifying what may or may not be custom. And then that solves the problem, because now you got a treaty on it. So this is another area where I go back to offshore resource limits. Part of the United Nations Convention is establishing economic zones for fishing, mining, etc., that essentially have created custom through codification beyond 3 miles. And then other countries can agree to it, and that solves the problem. All right. More terms. And again, it's a little hard to explain. So how do you know if custom will be applied to a country? And again, we're talking more now about the court is having to decide if what is said as custom is actually law or not. So one way to determine if custom is binding upon a particular country is if they have incorporated that custom or that practice into their own domestic legislation. In other words, they have that rule domestically. Or if they have court decisions within their own country that follow that rule. And this goes back to what I said earlier. If I argue that that's not customary law, but in fact we have a court case in my own country saying it is, then I'm not really being consistent. So the doctrine of incorporation basically means the same general concept has been incorporated into your own domestic law. Either here in the United States, it might be through United States Code, which is legislated law from Congress, or perhaps Supreme Court decisions, or other federal court decisions, or even state court decisions. But typically they're going to look at Supreme Court level decisions. And if it can be shown that that customary practice, maybe not exactly the same, but is close domestically, then that's going to bind the country in an international court as well. Or the doctrine of transformation basically is the idea that custom does not bind a state until the state actually follows or does the same thing either internationally or internally. So even if it's not part of their own law, if the states